I'm Daniel R. And together with my colleague Remus Pereni, our CTO, we're talking about trends and the future of software development. So we've talked in the past, Remus, about the challenges for a software product company, and there are multiple challenges. And my question to you is, what do you see as the big trends? How will the processes and the work change in the future, given all the changes and all the challenges that are currently present?
Right. Well, definitely, let's say, investment cycles got, let's say, more frequent because because of the legislation changes, because of market changes, companies are forced to develop continuously, either new modules, new products, or change current existing products. So practically the trends focus on trying to improve or make it lean in such a way that practically you're investing less and making sure you're extracting more value from that investment.
Just a question, because you made an assumption that some changes on the market are pushing software changes all across the industries. But, well, from our experience, things are not necessarily similar in all industries. There are industries which are heavily dependent on regulations, and they change a lot. Also, there are industries which are more stable and where there are not so many drivers for change.
That's true. So not all industries are, let's say, subject of the same forces. But even the industries that are not subject of regulation changes usually have other type of challenges, like in the utilities industries, the fact that they need to expose more and more functionality to the end consumer, which means more applications, mobile applications, newer type of interfaces. It means that still you have to invest, let's say, even if the investments are maybe not as large as in creating a new product, you are continuously have to create new add-ons, have to adjust add-ons, have to expose services, have to create smaller mobile applications to expose various kind of services. So the challenge is there. The only question is, how can you, let's say, transform your internal processes in such a way that you're able to sustain a continuous drive of innovation, pushing features in such a way that they are still keeping the costs under control. So you can do that in a sustainable way. And the newer patterns and practices, although they are not new at all, we can see that practically there are adaptations from the factories and industries. The whole Toyota production system model, the whole Lean Six Sigma actually find its way into software development. Although some parts are already present, and for instance, Agile as a methodology for development, it's exactly the same Lean approach to developing software. But this is about other aspects that were not necessarily covered by Agile. Things like that have to do with how do you get the requirements, how do you validate the product. Because again, in general, the most expensive part of software development is the development itself. So if you can validate a product, if you can run over various type of prototypes before getting to actual development, you can get up with a more efficient way to develop products, less costly, with more impact on the customers. Also, if you're able to do things like hypothesis-driven development, many times we work based on assumptions that we do not validate. So even if we adopt Agile, sometimes user story goes, as a product owner or as an administrator, I would like to. But there is actually a fundamental assumption that that user type actually wants or has some kind of value or business value in that type of operation. And just surfacing that assumption and making sure that that assumption is validated, you actually make products or make features that are, let's say, better suited to provide value to the users than just throwing features out there and hoping that they kind of serve or hit the sweet spot. So in general, the practices, and actually there is a book called The Lean Enterprise, which kind of gathers most of these practices and tries to apply them to enterprise development. So you have things like continuous delivery, which continuous delivery only makes sense, for instance, if you practice hypothesis-driven development, because practically you are constantly working with a set of assumptions that you try to disprove prior to actually building. And if you cannot disprove, it means that there is probably some value in those ideas, and implementing them as actually tracking them. So the tracking part is part of the enunciation of the problem. So you build something and you make sure that you can track the value delivered. And if it's not delivering the value, you pivot, exactly like in lean startup.
But my question is, what you're saying makes sense for a large horizontal product or platform or service. So, Facebook or Google, they can introduce in a stealthy way new features for some of the users. They see how they respond to multiple options, variants of that feature, or Amazon is doing the same. They have a lot of upgrades every day. And then based on the response, based on seeing to which option the user respond in the best way, they can pick and choose what's the best way to go forward. And that makes perfect sense for a website like Amazon. How do you translate that to a software product company, which maybe it's not even operating in the SaaS model, so you still have the on-premise way of working with your customers? How do you take that idea and make it very pragmatic in a VMS or a generic product company?
Right, you're absolutely right. So some of the things that work very well and are designed for testing large user bases for consumer applications might be more difficult to adapt to the enterprise settings. But there are other practices like prototyping, like customer-driven development, lean customer-driven development, that kind of sets up how you find your best customers. Because many times the assumption is like my biggest customer is my test customer. And that's a wrong approach, because usually the biggest customer also have processes that are not on the same level as 80% of your customers. So if you plan or prepare a feature for your biggest customer, it means that it will be off the charts for the rest 80% of your customers, which might not be the biggest customer, but might provide the most revenue. So there are many practices that can be taken and can be adapted to the enterprise world. Also, the way they approach, for instance, continuous delivery makes sense for the bigger setting, but it also makes sense for enterprise application, because practically it forces you to decouple deployment from release. Like in our situation, almost always deployment with release is the same thing. You're planning for a set of feature that you're going to release together with the deployment. But that doesn't have to necessarily be that way. And by decoupling release from deployment, you can prepare a set of experiments or features that you're only enabling for a small set of users. And you're testing that with your early adopters. And if you see that the features are indeed providing the value you expected, that were part of the assumptions, then you can release gradually for the rest of the users. And that there is also a perception that is associated with SaaS web-based solutions. And if you look at what happens with modern browsers like Chrome and Microsoft Edge or Firefox, they are native applications and they are part of a continuous delivery process. So you're no longer aware whenever there is an update going on, and you still get it. Even cars, with Tesla, you buy the hardware and you get constant updates with new features and improvements.
Yeah, I was going to say, for some of the software like a web browser, that's not a critical software, so you can still run your business even if the browser moves some buttons around. But in case you have a financial application and you don't know anymore how to invoice because some button moved somewhere, that's a different problem. But I think that's more of a usability or UX design issue. Because if it's not designed well, it's going to take a lot of effort to learn the new
That's
method.
also a misconception, because there is the perception that if you're doing releases, let's say, less often, your releases will be safer because somehow you will manage to test them better. But actually, this have been proven that if you're bringing the pay forward, so practically you're making smaller releases. So indeed, if it breaks, it does affect probably a number of users. But because the release contains less features than a bigger release, actually the chances of breaking are smaller, and the chances of providing fixes are faster and quicker and less painful than in the bigger planned releases.
But I still heard stories where customers were saying, we like this version, please don't touch it. Just keep it as it is. And I wonder, it can be an issue on the customer side where they are just, defensive and like the status quo. It can also be an issue of the software itself, where if it's a bit buggy, of course, once you get to a stable version, you don't want to have your
Yeah, but that's also part of the way we do the traditional releases, because if you have 2 releases per year, the amount of functionality,
it's a lot.
So practically, if you missed use cases or configuration details or things like that, you're pretty much guaranteed to introduce bugs and pain for customers. But by bringing, let's say, releases more often, bringing the pain forward, you're also forced to deal with things like hotfixes, with things like rollovers or rollbacks and so on. So you're forced to go through a situation in which bad things can happen. So you're forced to deal and automate that. So in case things happen, you're in the end in the position to fix it faster with less downtime, as you're not doing this approach. So actually it's been proven, although it's much more difficult to do, and it might be challenging till you get everything right, once you do it properly, it actually has less impact on the customer than the traditional way of doing deployments.
But what if, I still go back to what I've heard. What if a customer, again, is in an industry where the amount of rule and regulation change is minimal? So, governmental context doesn't influence it that much. It's a stable industry. It's an on-premise deployment. What would you say to a company which has that kind of situation?
Well, if you have no features to develop, then don't. So, but in general, let's say one of the big advantages, having a continuous delivery flow doesn't mean that you have to ship major features every day or every week. We had unfortunate situations in which we were actually releasing too often, especially for newer applications where the amount of functionality developed, it's very fast at the beginning, and the user were not able to catch up with the release notes and with the functionalities. But in general, that doesn't mean that you cannot have a release plan. It doesn't mean that you cannot develop those major features and hide them from the users till the right moment. So that means that you're able to deliver fixes on a very fast pace. It means that you're able to run experiments, like trying to see if there are better ways to solve a problem, if there are better ways to improve performance or other factors of the application, while releasing the things that you want in the order you want for the select users you want to release to. So it kind of teaches you a more mature way of releasing and deploying applications with all the processes and all the let's say, models behind that. It forces you to address all the aspects and automate all the aspects. Because that's also part of the problem, because if you, for instance, don't have the configuration management and deployment automation in order, it might be that the application is perfect, but it's so flexible in terms of configuration that practically it is a problem in terms of let's say, it's just difficult to have a reliable release, consistent reliable release for new versions.
Yeah, well, for sure, the more complexity you have on the deployment scenario, the harder it is to have this streamlined approach, because we've had situations with customers working very diverse situations total different hardware setups at different end users, different databases, database size, and so forth. So it's actually quite hard to have one process which is streamlined for everybody. And of course, I think the move towards the cloud is actually going to help, because deployment, you can better manage that environment. It's something more predictable. Scaling up is easier. DevOps operations are centralized. So it really makes sense to do it more. It makes more sense to do it in a cloud deployment.
So it's not a whole new approach to doing development. It's just a continuation of the agile development that we practice in terms of development, but putting the right thing before the gathering the requirements with lean customer-driven development and lean UX, and making sure that you're able to sustain all the processes that are agile and experimentation at the deployment side with continuous delivery. So it's like fixing the whole cycle, making sure that you have a very lean stream, very efficient, without waste, and you're checking that. And practically, it introduces methods from manufacturing, like value stream maps, in which you actually look at the software production process as a manufacturing process, and look at waste, and look at cycle times, and look at where are the bottlenecks. Because in general, optimizing a process that is not the weakest link, it's no optimization at all. So you have to make sure you understand which is the weakest link, where your waste is, and measure that and actually improve on that.
So actually your point is that the approach should be holistic, and it doesn't help too much that you're optimizing one part of the process which is above average. If there are two other parts of the process which are below average, the end result will not be much better. And actually, I've seen situations where the technical people or the software people were actually very happy about something, but overall it was not a success, or vice versa. Other parts were doing great, and because software had an issue, again, it was not a success overall, and that's where alignment is.
And unfortunately, here the enterprise world is lagging behind a lot in terms of focus on what's happening with the product once released.
Why do you think that is?
It's an anti-pattern, I believe. It comes from the fact that software companies, vertical software companies, were focused on releasing functionalities, addressing functionality requests from customers, and the functionalities themselves was the value of the application. While these days the functionalities are no longer the value of the application, making sure that the processes provide the right value, are properly designed, are tuned to actually make sure that they hit the right spot, is the value point of an application. And I think nobody's actually looking at that. We are just releasing applications, throwing them to the customer, and hope that the customer will know what to do with it. But honestly, I think it's more like a norm than exception, that in general, our customers have no idea if their customers use the application, if modules are in use, how well those modules perform, and so on. These are aspects that are not really monitored. And I think these are valuable aspects, because that's how you establish the value of a product, and you drive actually value in your product.
Well, I think it's the same difference like between being efficient and being effective. I mean, you can do a lot, but if it's not the right things which are really needed, it doesn't help that much. And to me, it sounds like you're making the case for some kind of analytics, because I know analytics as a tool is quite used in the consumer applications, where actually you have a huge number of customers, and there's no way you can know what each one of them is doing. I mean, if you're Google or Microsoft, nobody will be. Well, of course, they are talking to a select number of customers, but the percentage of total customers that they are talking to is actually small. While when you're having a large product for a few customers, certainly a smaller number than Microsoft has, the approach is in a way more personal, but maybe sometimes we rely too much on this personal approach and don't do it systematically, so that we have a very objective way of measuring who's using what in the application.
I think it starts with analytics, and it starts with analytics for at least two major reasons. One, is because honestly, in a legacy application that has been developed for 10 or 20 years, not all the application is used anymore. And without analytics, it's very difficult to say which part of application is no longer used, it's out of use. And the problem is when you're trying to rewrite part of the application, because you will approach the whole application, even if some of it is not used. So it actually will increase the cost of rewriting, when with a little bit of analytics, you would be able to figure out which parts of the code is no longer used, is dead code actually, and you can eliminate. And that's one problem with code, that code doesn't rotten. So practically it stays there and it will ask for refactorings, and it will actually keep asking for being fed by developers spending time on it, and so on. The second aspect is that by understanding how the users use the application, actually it's almost a surprise whenever you release a new product on how users will use the application. You can always assume a specific execution way in the application, but you will always be amazed how the customers will end up using. So if you're not looking, you have no idea how the customers are using the application, if they're using it correctly or not. So by having analytics, you actually can monitor if they are using the right way, if they are using processes in the right way, if they have problems, for instance, in processes. Some problems could be easily solved with a little bit of UX. Other problems are more deep problems, performance problems, then it's a different way to approach them. But if you're not looking, if you're not tracking that, you're not aware of that. You're only aware that the customer complained that application doesn't have the right quality or feels sluggish, but actually don't have any insights into what caused that those problems. So analytics, by looking at those problems, we at least make light into what are the problems and what are the usability problems of the application. But also, in general, Lean Enterprise states that a product is no longer feature-driven. To add a new feature, it's very expensive. You have to prove that that feature has value, and that has to go through a lengthy process as customer-driven, lean design, and so on. So actually, in Lean Enterprise, you have to focus on existing features because those are the features that already have proven the value. So trying to improve existing processes that are core for the business, processes that already are valuable for your customers, make more sense than just adding features upon features that are questionable if add anything but technical depth to the application.
And I think a very simple way to check if what you're adding is valuable is if the customer is willing to pay for that.
Right.
If they're not willing to pay for that, it's a nice to have feature, but not necessarily a crucial one.
And also it supports development trends like hypothesis-driven development, where you start with the assumptions. And with the assumptions, you also put the metrics the KPIs that you expect to change. And the KPIs is not necessarily just added users, as in the consumer application, but it also increases in terms of processes executed per day, it increases in terms of process speeds, and so on.
Okay. Well, so to conclude, your point is, besides making software development more efficient, we want to make sure that we're building the right thing and that the thing that we're building is actually used. And that's the way you're closing the circle. And I remember one image that we talked about once, because in software we're dealing with an immaterial world. So it's very hard to really assess what we're building. Had we been working in a manufacturing plant, it's quite easy to notice, bottlenecks wherever things are stacked high because some process is blocking all the others. Well, luckily there are tools also in the software industry like Jira and others which give you visibility into what you're doing, but still it's a bit less visible to the outside world.
And you need practices like value stream mapping to actually surface that those processes, those activities.
Okay, well, so the challenge is to make our immaterial code and work as visible as possible.
Right.
And then start from there and improve it.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. Have a great day. See you next time.